We will now then move on to form high energy emission. We will move on to coherent emission. And coherent emission is primarily we are talking about radio wavelengths. High energy emission is at all other bands, starting from infrared all the way to high energy gamma. So, coherent emission at radio wavelengths, clearly, as the term implies, it means that you have in-phase emission added up from multiple charge particles. So, therefore, one cannot treat this as a single particle phenomenon anymore. You have to look at collective phenomena. And of course, what we have in pulsar magnetospheres is a plasma. And the plasma has many collective modes. At very high energies, where the wavelength is small, we got away by treating that plasma as a collection of individual particles and looking at individual particles. At radio wavelengths, where the wavelength is large, the scale is larger than the typical properties of the plasma, then we will have difficulty in treating this as single particle emission. So collective modes have to be looked at. Nonetheless, when you look at emission mechanism, we can still go a long way by looking at the primary emission mechanism from single particles and then enhancing it by attributing that emission to a group of particles. And for radio emission in particular, the only emission mechanism that is of relevance is curvature radiation in that form. So, like in high energy case, to look at the key physical ingredients of these models, we have to go back to Mal Ruderman. Ruderman Sutherland 1975 laid the foundation of the description of radio frequency emission from pulsars. Later on, other models have come up, but the description, the language, and so on, they were all set out in this paper. So, while you may not, other models later may not agree in detail with the emission mechanism proposed here, the basic framework, language of description, and so on are very similar. So it is important to understand this foundation. Today we will just do a description of Ruderman Sutherland paper. Part of the description of Ruderman Sutherland paper we have already done when we are trying to introduce pulsar magnetospheres. We have talked about gaps, we have talked about pair production, we have talked about particle, we have talked about radiation from particles, and we have talked about optical depth for pair production for photons. So all of that remains. This now we will go towards how all of that background can be used to try to understand radio emission. Now, the ingredients that are used to explain radio emission in this model is, first of all, charge bunching at sub-wavelength scale, and that is necessary to have coherent emission, as we have already discussed. Then you need active pair production at polar cap, because the entire Ruderman Sutherland model for radio emission is a polar cap emission model. So you have to have active pair production at polar cap. Then once you have pair plasma, then you have to find a mechanism by which the plasma could form bunches. And once the bunch is formed, then the bunch has to move in the local electric and magnetic field, and that will give rise to some radio emission morphology. Now, some conditions which have to be fulfilled for all this to occur is that you need to have a sustained pair production in the polar cap gap. To have sustained pair production, you need to have this quantity chi, which I had introduced before in the context of optical depth of photons producing pairs. So that has to be above a certain value, so that you have sufficient optical depth, so that multiple generations of pair production can occur and avalanche can be sustained. This is the condition. Now you can fold it in through the field geometry and use curvature radiation for H cross omega, and then put it all together. Then this condition can be written as a condition on the spin period of the pulsar. So the critical spin period, once you apply this pair production condition, turns out to be this. It is B12 is the surface magnetic field in units of 10 to the 12 Gauss.
It's for the dipolar field, right?
No. This is a general description. So this is there's a field strength at the surface in units of 10 to the 12 Gauss. If you have multipole, you have to use the strength of the local field, strength of the local multipole. Okay. Then this is radius in units of 10 kilometers, stellar radius. This is the radius of curvature of the field in units of 10 to the 6 centimeters. So if it's dipole, you will put dipole formula for the rho 6. If it is some other multipole, then you will use a different value of rho 6. So this is the difference in this expression compared to Starrett's 1971 expression, where in place of rho 6, the dipole curvature was used. So that gives you a different limit. But because near the surface, a dipole field line has radius of curvature which is much larger than 10 to the 6 centimeters. Okay?
Larger than, yes.
Much larger than 10 to the 6 centimeters. So therefore, although this power is only about a third, you still get a critical period which is sub-second if you use dipole curvature. 15 chi, the condition is 15 chi must be greater than 1. So it's of the order of 1. So that milliseconds. Now, as I said, dipole curvature will limit this pair production to below sustenance in fairly fast pulsars. To explain the longest periods we see for typical surface fields, this typical estimate of the surface field you can get from PP dot.
So yeah, you see, for the PP dot, when we calculate the magnetic field,
it's the dipole component.
It's a dipolar.
Correct. So I'm saying take that as a ballpark estimate. So, if you do that, then the rho 6 you will need to explain pulsars that are observed has to be of the order 1 or smaller.
That is not possible.
So dipole, that is not possible. So that leads you to the conclusion that for this mechanism to work, near the surface there must be contribution from multiple fields. You need rho 6, which is of the order 1 or smaller. And if that multiple component has a stronger field strength, that of course helps. So that if B12 is higher and Rho6 is smaller. Then,
See, I have a question. Suppose we look at some critical period, that means the longest period pulsar if we take.
Yeah.
Suppose we know the period of the from our data, we can calculate the period, right?
yes.
Now, if I want to conclude what is the magnetic field as and what could be the magnetic field geometry, right? But all the polarization study people do, right, to get the information about what could be the geometry of the magnetic field.
Yeah, but that is not at the surface.
Yeah, that is not at the surface, so it brings us with the conclusion that probably is dipolar only. It's
Right. In the much of the emission region still sees it up.
right. Now the question is that if I want to put the value of B12 over there, and how will I estimate? Because
No, you don't have any independent estimate. All I'm saying is that if you assume everything is dipole, it doesn't work. Dipole field, you can get an estimate.
that I can do. Right?
Dipole Rho6, you can estimate. If you put that in, you can't satisfy.
But that, yeah, that
So all it tells you is that you need a multiple. It is not telling you what is the geometry of the multiple, what is the strength of the multiple. But multiple is necessary.
yes. Then how to calculate that means how to get an idea of
So you only be able to get a combination of these quantities. B12 square by R by rho 6 to the power of 4 by 13.
nothing more can be done.
Nothing more can be done from just this condition alone. You might want to get other observational constraints out, which are independent. Maybe surface thermal emission, and if you look at the temperature distribution near the polar cap, that might tell you something about the field geometry. But you have to use additional constraints to actually consider what is the geometry and what is the strength of these multiple fields. P12 is the total field strength, by the way. Multiple plus dipole.
Everything at the surface.
Everything together at the surface. And rho 6 is the net field curvature with all multiples added together. So you are not looking at individual multiples separately. Yeah. This is the net field and the net radius of curvature. Okay. But be that as it may, this tells you that at a certain field period combination, the pair production cannot be sustained anymore, and you will not have any further polar cap gap emission possible for those objects, and so your radio emission will stop. So there will be something called a death line, and empirically from the pulsar observations we know that this death line exists. So this is one aspect just from the criterion for pair production sustenance that you can say about some feature of the observed radio pulsars. Question.
How do we get the P dot critical also fruits because deadline is a line PP dot diagram.
P and B.
Oh, I have
This
B.
is under
Yeah,
P and
yeah,
B.
yeah. I have B, so I can revert it to P dot again by dipolar.
Yeah, so you can plot the death line in BP plot. So then you get a P and B combination. So that you can try to get from here. Okay. Right. So now let's look at the charge dynamics in the polar cap gap in a little bit more detail. Now suppose there is this pulsar magnetosphere which is filled with plasma, and if E dot B is 0 everywhere, then we have seen that there will be a net electric field here which is basically perpendicular to the magnetic field, and in the presence of an electric field and the magnetic field, any charged particle will field is E cross B drift, and that E cross B drift will be with a velocity which is given by this. If and tan E dot B is equal to 0, then we have also seen that E cross B drift will just reproduce the rotation of the pulsar. So you will have magnetosphere co-rotating with the pulsar. But if there is a gap and E dot B is not entirely equal to 0, in that case, there will be an extra drift because of this additional component of the electric field. The value that it doesn't have fully E dot B equal to 0. So then, on top of this co-rotation, you will have an extra drift. And that extra drift is basically, sorry?
In this open field line region.
Wherever there is E dot B not equal to 0.
Yeah, and in this case, it's in the open field line region, right?
Yeah, so here we are talking about the polar cap gap, just above the polar cap. So in the Ruderman-Sutherland model, you can also see the geometry that is used. This is what we call antipulsar, we were talking about the other day, where the field line and the magnetic field and the spin are antiparallel. And then it is made inclined here. And that is because in this model, Ruderman-Sutherland wanted positive charges to be pulled out of the surface. So that polarity appears when you have this configuration. Why do you want positive charges to pull out of the surface? And that is because you can then appeal to the fact that ions are held to the star with certain amount of work function. So unless the voltage exceeds certain amount, you cannot pull out the particles. Electrons are much more loosely bound. So if you reverse the polarity, you will get a large amount of charge flow in any case. So at the time of this work, the view was that there is a strong work function which holds ions to the surface. So you have to create a voltage drop for ions to be pulled out. And once ions are pulled out, then they will be accelerated, they will do pair production, and then you get electron-positron pairs. And very close to the surface, you will then have the primary electrons which will proceed towards the surface and hit the surface and heat it up, and positrons will flow out. So those are primary positrons, and those primary positrons will then produce many electron-positron pairs. But all those electron-positron pairs, both charges will flow out because most of them will land up in a region where there is no further E dot B. But pairs are created with a momentum which is forward going because the gamma rays which get produced, they are produced by curvature radiation with charged particles moving along the magnetic field. So in this case then, to have this electric field which will pull out ions from the surface, you will have a gap, and the height of the gap is of the order of the width of the gap. That's what is in the basic picture here. The width is the polar cap, size, which is related to the spin period of the pulsar. You take the last open field line and trace it back to the stellar surface.
Is that just coincidence, or it's a requirement, this width and height?
Yeah, so height is not assumed to be exactly equal to the polar cap, but of the order, so that there is a certain volume over which this process can act. If the H is much smaller than Rp, then the process is very inefficient. H is much greater than R2, then what happens is that later part of the polar cap gap becomes ineffective as the high energy photons already produce pairs, and then the pair production probability drops exponentially to the power minus 1 by chi. So it just drops. So therefore, even if you have E dot B up to a very large distance, most of the pair production is already over before it. So the later part is not that important. So when these two are of the same order, that's roughly it gives you most efficient production of particles with the rest of it sort of screened out by the pairs which are produced.
So technically, suppose if anybody wants to calculate, so given the dipole, I assume that there is a dipolar geometry. I have P, I have P dot, so I know B field also. So now I can compute what will be the size of the polar cap. Right?
Yeah.
And once I know the size of the polar cap, then I know the footprint of the magnetic field lines, and second, from there, also using the formula of this chi, I can then get the mean free path. Right now, if I want to compute that, now I know the radius of area of the diameter of the polar cap. How this depends on the magnetic field. Now, how then I can go step by step. Say for example, over there, I know B. I can compute E dot B over there. Right?
Yes.
And then where is this thing coming? Means E dot B. How to put it in equations to put that effect of E dot B, that it's probably, and also this probability is going down. So the effective height above.
Okay, so E dot B doesn't tell you what is the energy that the particle will attain. So E dot B times distance gives you the energy that the particle will attain, because the acceleration has to operate over a certain distance to accelerate the particle. So it's the voltage drop which matters, right? And the critical voltage drop after which pair avalanche takes over is about 10 to the power of 12 volts. So you have to be able to accelerate the first primary particles in absence of radiation reaction. They have to be accelerated to about 10 to the power of 12 electron volts. And that is a typical value where the pair avalanche is sustained. Okay. So you can have a strong E dot B, but if you don't have enough gap size, particles will never reach there. So you put this condition that you need to reach about 10 to the power of 12 volts, and then ask what is the distance that the particles will have to move. Now, for a typical 1 second pulsar, the voltage drop horizontally across the polar cap is also about 10 to the power of 12 volts. So, a similar distance along the magnetic field also needs to be there, so that you can get a potential drop of about 10 to the power of 12 volts. So that's one thing. And then by the time you have reached that distance, when particles have already been accelerated to 10 to the power of 12 volts, then a furious amount of pair production is happening. Okay. So therefore, as more pair productions happen, you are going to quench this E dot B, right?
Drop.
Yes. And for the photon which is emitted, for it, the probability to produce pairs, that depends on the local magnetic field and the geometry of the photon trajectory with respect to the local magnetic field, which is all then combined in this quantity chi. And once you have reached the critical value of chi, you have pair production, and after that, as the field drops or as chi goes up, you have the mean free path, which is e to the power minus 1 by chi, that will then become much larger, and then so therefore probability of conversion of the photons into pairs, that will keep going down as you move away from the surface.
So one can technically start with a rough height to which there is a 10 to the power 12 volt, and then the tail, how long it can go, will get determined by the mean field path.
Yes, yes.
So there is a kind of slowly.
It is exponential drop, so it drops in almost practically immediately.
But now this 10 to the power 12 volt is basically the criteria which is determining everything.
Which is determining the size of the
Size of the height of the
Correct.
vacuum gap.
Correct.
Over there.
Correct.
Now, how do the people calculate this 10 to the power 12?
Oh, so for that you have to calculate for a given voltage drop, what is the curvature radiation limited gamma? From that curvature radiation limited gamma, you have to find what is the curvature radiation photon energy. And that curvature radiation photon energy has to have enough energy so that within that distance, given the once it is emitted, given the perpendicular field that it will see, it will have a free path, mean free path which is smaller than that for pair production, so that multiple generations of pair production can happen with that primary photon. So, okay, so go back the other way. You want to have pair cascade.
Right.
So to have the pair cascade, you must have sufficient energy in the incoming photon and sufficient perpendicular component of the magnetic field with respect to the trajectory of the electron, the trajectory of the photon. So from that, given the rate of divergence of fields and so on, you can put a limit on the minimum energy of the incoming primary photon that you should have. So then you ask what should be the energy of the charged particle which can emit a curvature photon of that energy. And that will turn out to be 10 to the power 12 electron volts. So to have a substantial pair production, you will need.
So technically there is also a distribution over there.
Of course there is a distribution.
So
Yeah. So none of these numbers are just a fixed hard number. These are just typical numbers. So that's this number. 10 to the power 12 volts is what you need for pair production to be sustained.
It strongly depends on the multiplicity we want.
The primary particles have. This is for the primary particles.
Right, but also we want the secondary particles to again accelerate and.
Yeah. So for the this is trying to simulate a situation where the multiplicity in the final pair plasma is much larger than the primary particles. So multiplicity going towards infinity. That is the limit.
I think I understand. This is the step 1, right? Where we just take only a certain bunch of particles to initiate the process. So technically, we can take, say, a small distribution of photon energy.
Yeah.
And then we see that from that small distribution of photon energy, turning out, putting in the curvature radiation formula, what should be the energy distribution or the gamma of the.
No, actually, even to do that, the limit that you are putting is that the secondary particles which are produced, they are energetic enough to sustain the pair cascade. So the photons that will produce the secondary particles have to be energetic enough so that the secondary pair production is with high Lorentz factor. And the curvature radiation generated by the secondary particles will be larger than pair production threshold. and we'll have enough optical depth left to do tertiary production. So it's not just one step. To say that you sustain a pair cascade, you start with a very large multiplicity and you have to work back.
The secondary and tertiary photons are pair producing above the gap, outside the gap.
Not all of them. No. Primary particles will convert entirely within the gap. Secondary particles, some within, some outside. Tertiary will be outside.
So isn't that a problem? It becomes quickly dipolar, and can it still? It will require
No, so
very high energy photons for it.
Yes. So all this pushes you to the primary particles to be of very high energy. Right?
So Dipankar, does that mean the secondary plasma that is formed, or the electron positron, where E dot P is equals to 0, so there it is formed very close to the surface?
No. So secondary plasma is formed near the upper edge of the polar cap.
Okay.
So
So just outside the
So basically, secondary plasma is beginning to try to screen the polar cap gap, but it has not fully screened it yet. So you go through the secondary plasma, full secondary plasma builds up, then tertiary is beginning to be produced. At that point, you have enough charge which can fully screen out the polar cap.
so the secondary plasma. So what is the typical height it is formed away from the surface?
Yes, so that's what I was saying. That is the height of the polar cap, which is roughly about 10 to the 4th 10 centimeters.
So around 10 to the 4th.
Around 100 meters.
100 meters.
Yeah. So it's around 100 meters, and this is also about 100 meters. It's all within this model, and you change some basic parameters, some basic geometry, those numbers might change. And today we know that this is probably not a very sustainable mechanism, because the main ingredient here is that ions are held strongly at the surface, and that may or may not be true. So if ions are not held strongly at the surface, if the work function is too small, then it doesn't matter what geometry you produce, you are still easily pulling out charged particles, and you can easily short out this gap. But we know that due to GR effects, due to frame dragging, no matter what is the work function, you will always have uncompensated E dot B near the polar cap. And that is what is going to drive this. Yes.
So, but even if the ions are actually taken out from the surface, in case the work function is not as high as expected, so it will not be able to short out the gap in the time scale that we actually see, right? So how many ions?
So let's say infinite number of ions are pulled out from the surface, which will satisfy the local Goldreich-Julian charge density. Then E dot B will go to 0. The distance can be very small over which.
But then it is becoming very difficult for pair cascade, right? So ions will be heavier. So typically it is 1000 times heavier than the electrons. So wouldn't the accelerator, even if it is 10 to the 12 volts,
Yeah.
the gamma factor will be high enough so that the curvature photons produced by the ions.
Yes, that is taken into account. In this number of 10 to the 12 volts, that is taken into account.
So you're saying even if this picture is not accurate, the GR effects are sufficient to produce a gap?
GR effect is sufficient to retain a E dot B near the polar cap. So therefore, the polar cap gap will still be active. Will not be as active as the current sheet that we have seen, but it will still be active.
But it will produce a gap where the potential drop is 10 particles. Should.
Yes, it will have a gap. And here, for example, once you produce enough number of charged particles, the gap gets shorted out. So in case of GR, that is not the mechanism. No matter what you do, the gap always exists, because it comes from the breakdown of the correlation the omega as you define in the local frame is not the same as the omega of the star. But this difference also tends to zero as you go away from the surface. Because the larger the distance, the smaller is the lengthening drive. So beyond a certain point, this effect also is not important. So it in effect produces a gap which may be of different size now, 100 meters, maybe somewhat larger than 100 meters, but over which E dot B will continue to exist. E dot B equal to 0 will not be satisfied. But after that, because the lengthening effect goes down rapidly as you go away from the stellar surface, you will just merge to standard Goldreich time solution. So it produces a similar effect. Dimensions could be somewhat different, but it is not due to this effect that is assumed here. And it is independent now of the work function of the surface. You can pull out as many particles as you like, you will still have the T dot T.
But it's also non-stationary, right? And when you consider GR effect, and that non-stationary.
Why should it be non-stationary if it is GR effect?
Why should it? No, we saw that it still has this structure where the acceleration is high, and then for a short time it's not. So there is a.
Yeah, so those are plasma effects. So that is not due to GR.
Okay.
That is due to collective modes in the plasma, which will occur here also.
The collective modes are different than here in this picture. What we have is the gap is produced is pair production, and it quenches the gap and it reduces, and that is why the non-stationarity comes, right?
That non-stationarity is not there in the GR mode.
It's not.
Because irrespective of the amount of charge you produce, the voltage drop is always there, right? So therefore, as long as there is a steady current, you will always have this voltage drop, and there is no non-stationarity involved there a priori, just because of GR. But because of plasma collective effects, you will always have some non-stationarity. The GR alone does not impose non-stationarity. Here also, in this picture what I just said, the non-stationarity is not imposed. You say that, okay, you will have charge particle pulled out, it will accelerate, and then at some point you have enough pairs produced. Beyond that point, E dot B goes to 0. You can have that as a steady state picture. You're not saying that there is non-stationarity. But as you go through the arguments in this paper, it will say that there will be non-stationarity, because when you produce a certain bunch of pairs, then the pairs will also invade the gap and it will reduce the E dot B. And then those particles move out. Then again the gap is produced. Then you get another discharge. So here the spark discharge picture gives you a non-stationarity in the process itself, a temporal non-stationarity.
But this process doesn't happen in the GR case.
It doesn't have to happen.
Doesn't happen. But
Okay. So then let's then try to estimate what this excess velocity will be. Actually, it will be excess velocity in the opposite direction, so you will have the charges lagging behind. And so if delta V is the potential drop in the polar cap this way, and the polar cap is sort of contained within a region like this, polar cap gap is contained within a region like this. So at the outer edge, the potential is 0. So going from here to there, you build a certain potential drop. Similarly, going from there to there, because here the potential is 0, here the potential is 0, here the potential is 0. So going from here to there, you get the same potential drop from center to the edge of the gap, because the potential drop is is 0 at the edge of the gap.
So from F to B, same, and from F to E.
Yeah, so this is in a zero potential. This whole surface is zero potential. The edge of the gap is zero potential. But in the gap, there is a potential building up. So from here, whether you go this way or go that way, you will get the same potential drop. And it is a potential drop this way now, which then matters for E cross B drift. Because
It's from E to A.
E cross B, right? Yeah.
I'm saying from the geometry small e to A.
Yes. So that potential drop in that direction gives you the E cross B drift. And since roughly in magnitude it will be similar to this, so you can then replace that, and then so delta V is, so B by B squared 1 by B has come here, and E times distance, the distance is about RP. RP is the polar cap radius. That is your delta V. So then, delta V by RP plus is your magnitude of E. So this then gives you a order of magnitude estimate of the excess velocity or the velocity by which it will lag behind the rotation. Delta V, as I said, is of the order of 12 volts. So with this excess speed, then the charged particle will now circulate around the magnetic axis. This will give you a drift velocity, which is perpendicular to the magnetic field, and charges with this drift velocity will circulate with the around the magnetic axis like this.
All the particles above the polar cap region.
Yeah, it's either a particle or a bunch
What
will
is the charge?
circulate with this, with this speed, and the circumference is 2 pi rp. So divide 2 pi rp by this delta v, then you get the period that a charged bunch will take to circulate around this. This you can Brp plus square is actually the flux moving through the polar cap. Actually, pi Brp square is the flux moving through the polar cap. So the magnetic flux moving through the polar cap divided by the voltage, which is roughly 10 to the 12 volts, and C, which is which then gives you the period of circulation of charges in the polar cap due to E cross B drift. Let's call that P3 hat. And now, when we're looking at bunches, let's say the polar cap has not just one such spark which produces bunches, but n such sparks which produces bunches. So, for an observer, when you look at it, one charged bunch may have moved out, but some other charged bunch may come and take its place. So, in the fluctuation spectrum, what you will get is a period which is this divided by the number of charged bunches. So, every single charged bunch will complete the rotation in time P3 hat, but when you take a charged bunch, an array of charged bunches, let's say equally spaced, and there are n of them, and as you move by P3 by n, some other charge bunch has taken its place. So therefore, the observed period will be P3 by n, P3 hat by n, or observed frequency will be higher by factor of n. So this is one of the key predictions of this model, and this is geared towards explaining drifting subpulses. So this is a schematic diagram. If the pulsar has a overall average profile like that in radio, if you look at individual pulses often don't have this shape. They have a small subpulse somewhere within this envelope. The next pulse will have another subpulse or a couple of subpulses at some other positions of this envelope, and so on and so on. When you integrate them over a large number of pulses, then you get this. But individual pulses don't never show you this. And when you look at the progression of these subpulses from pulse to pulse, you see these bands. These are called drift bands. And there people define two periods, P1, three periods. P1 being the spin period of the pulsar itself. P2 is in a given pulse, separation between two subpulses. And P3 is the period of reoccurrence of a subpulse at the same longitude. So if you have these two drift bands, the vertical separation between the two drift bands is P3. And the P3 that we just talked about in the previous slide refers to this P3. So if you, for example, if you had just one spark, then starting from here, it will go around. By the time it comes back here, it would have taken the time P3.
So this P2 is basically in a single pulse. If one look at it, is basically the separation. It will be shown up as another component, right?
Yes, multiple subpulses in the same pulse. Okay, so this is a schematic diagram.
So what information that this P2 will give?
It will tell you what is the n, number of bunches
Yes.
in a pulse.
Assuming it's symmetric and
Yeah, assuming it's symmetric and so on. So now, this is, as I said, a schematic diagram. This is actual observation of one of the pulsars, 0943 plus 10. This picture is from Deshpande and Rankin in 1999, where they took this picture seriously, and then from the data try to reconstruct the distribution of sparks around this drifting region, and they call that carousel. So it's a carousel of sparks which rotate, and they reconstructed it by looking at the intensity pattern of the drift bands over a large number of pulses, and then they saw a clear periodicity at 37.5 times the spin period. And that then is attributed to the carousel rotation period. And within that carousel rotation period, how many of our subpulses occur are actually different sparks crossing your line of sight. Okay. So they, using that, they produced something called a cartographic transform, and then you map the distribution of emission region on the polar cap. And these points are the bright regions, which are responsible for subpulses. And the line of sight also is marked here as this line. So given the geometry, your line of sight executes that motion as the in each period. The single period line of sight will go like this. And this whole carousel rotates with a period of 37.5 times the pulse period. And here there are 20 individual spark points, which is as reconstructed from the observational data. So this gives you a graphic picture of how the charge bunches are present in the polar cap, and they rotate to produce the subpulse drift pattern. One more thing I have noticed in this work is that you take this pulsar, you take data lasting over a very, very long period, from months to years, and you reconstruct this. The pattern that you come up with is very similar. Okay, maybe a rotated version of it, but the pattern remains similar. You have 20 such points, and they rotate to produce drifting subpulses. So this pattern for this pulsar is stable over a very long time. Whatever be the physical mechanism that is giving you this distribution of sparks on the stellar surface, that appears to be a stable mechanism, which is a property of the pulsar itself. I don't think there is a full understanding of it as yet as to what might cause that. Remember, this is a structure which is drifting with respect to the magnetic axis. So you cannot attribute this to fixed magnetic structure which is frozen in the magnetic field frame. So let's say it's easy for me to say that, okay, I have some multipolar field on the stellar surface which has a certain distribution, and that then gives me a spark pattern. But then that magnetic field pattern is not rotating with respect to the magnetic field.
Yes.
This spark pattern is rotating with respect to the magnetic field, and yet it retains this shape as it rotates. And this specific shape is retained for years. So there is more to it than just magnetic structure on the stellar surface. What exactly it is not fully understood, and it has to do with the way plasma bunching occurs in the azimuthal direction.
But is it easy to maintain such symmetric structure in a very non-dipolar field geometry? Shouldn't be a problem.
No, as long as you know how this symmetric structure is produced, then you will be able to answer that question. Suppose I say that, okay, if one spark is produced somewhere, it produces a minimum exclusion zone within which another spark cannot be produced. And suppose the whole polar cap is trying to make sparks. But once one spark is produced, the next spark cannot be produced within a certain minimum distance. So then the next sparks will appear at a certain distance with respect to it. But once they appear, they'll also have their own exclusion zones. So in presence of such pulse, such as spark exclusion zones, you can explain something like this.
And also in this data, we are able to sample only this ring region, but inside also there would be sparks pretty
That
much
is right.
equally
See,
spaced.
in this data, the line of sight does not go below this. So therefore, you don't know what is there inside. That is correct.
But most likely it is,
Yes.
if you assume such a thing, then
Sure.
thickly spaced
That is correct.
collection.
Yes. Now, drifting subpulses are seen in many pulsars, but not in all pulsars. So, the phenomenology that you use to explain this should also include cases where drifting subpulses are not seen. Now, that is also possible in a sense if, for example, your line of sight cuts this moment here in the middle. Let's say you have a central traverse of your line of sight. Actually, you will not see drifting subpulses then.
But my pulse profile will be very wide, right? In that case.
It will be wider, but you will have you do not have these entering at different longitudes in your pulse envelope. So next time another one enters your line of sight, it will enter at the same longitude. You will have basically stationary fluctuating intensity pattern at the same longitude. You will not have a drift band. So even geometry can be used to explain some of these cases where you don't see drifting subpulses. But then you will have to have so corresponding intensity modulation at the same longitude. Longitude stationary intensity modulation.